Well, good afternoon, or good evening, I should say. It's dark out. I'm Dr. Chris Jones. I'm the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to one of the intellectual highlights of our semester, which is our semester-by-semester College of Liberal Arts and Sciences lecture. And we have a really great professor and topic lined up for you today, Dr. Amy Scott from the Department of Psychology. I love this event. We get to hear from all types of folks and disciplines, and it really highlights the intellectual diversity and the vibrancy of the arts and sciences. And it also is a great indication of the in-house talent that we have within our college. So, you know, one of the traditions in academia is to bring outside experts in, and we should bring such folks to campus because they enrich our discourse. But we have to remember we have wonderful sources of expertise and scholarly acumen within our own ranks, and that's one of the reasons why we do this every semester. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Tim Kelso, Associate Professor and Chair of the Psychology Department, to introduce our star lecturer today. Dr. Kelso?
Thank you so much. I'm really appreciative for everybody that's here this evening. This is one of my favorite events of the semester, and I'm really gratified to get to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Bacon for us today. Dr. Bacon is trained as a clinical psychologist. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Texas. She was also a double major in government, for what that, I figure that's played some role in your selection process. She went on to earn her master's and her clinical PhD from the University of Arkansas. She also did her clinical internship at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston. As a graduate student, she had a research grant from the Howell Foundation to support her dissertation research, which was on factors related to anxiety in individuals with alcohol abuse problems. From the statistics, I can tell you that Amy is a terrific scholar. She's a fabulous scholar. She's been here at Bradley since 2011. She has 14 peer-reviewed publications, almost 50 conference presentations, and I really want to emphasize that among those conference presentations, she sponsored undergraduate student authorship 16 different times. And so she really sort of embodies exactly what we try to do here at Bradley. She's won multiple teaching awards, including First Year Faculty Award, and most recently a Caterpillar Inc. Faculty Achievement Award for teaching. Since coming to Bradley, she's twice built a bar lab. She serves as the director of her laboratory, which is the Stress, Emotion, and Alcohol Laboratory. And I'm so pleased that the president is here so that he can know that we have a bar on campus in case he didn't. Amy directs a bar lab, and of course it's sort of a hit on our tours. We'll show prospective students the type of research that we do, and we might take them back there. And I have a couple of students I can see that are in history of psychology or have taken it in the past. You know that I like to talk about Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And in Zen, the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, there's this story. It's related to this Church of Reason lecture that the author gives. And it's founded in the idea that there is the church that it served as a Catholic church, but the diocese had decided to close the parish down. They sold the property, and people bought the church and converted it into a bar. So you can imagine driving by, and there's this wonderful church facade with a Miller Lite sign, you know, hanging out the front. And the diocese would appoint this priest to come and talk about this, and he's like, look, it's not a church, it's a bar. It was desanctified, and if you don't know the difference, you're revealing more about yourself than anything else. And that's related then to the idea of the Church of Reason. The Church of Reason is not the podium and the classrooms and the salaries and everything else that is the business side of a university, but the real university, according to the book, it has no specific location. It owns no property, pays no salaries, receives no material dues. The university is a state of mind. It is that great heritage of rational thought that has been brought down through the centuries and which does not exist in a specific location. It's a state of mind which is regenerated throughout the centuries by a body of people. I believe there's too many universities that engage in what I refer to as transactional education. And I believe that what we do that is amazing about Bradley is we engage in transformational education, where you're put into positions where you can be changed. The students that have matriculated through Dr. Bacon's Bar Lab have had that opportunity to encounter problems, to overcome them, and to be contributors to society. They embody transformational education. And Dr. Bacon, I think, represents the very best of what we have at Bradley. And so without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Bacon, the director of the Stress, Emotion, and Alcohol Laboratory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kelso. Thank you all for attending on this Election Day Eve. And at a very busy time of the semester, so I want to acknowledge that this is time out of your schedule, and I very much appreciate you spending the time to spend it here with us. So I'd like to actually start my talk by continuing these thank yous. So I would like to thank the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Dean Jones, for this very kind and flattering invitation to speak publicly about my research program, as well as their help while I've been a junior faculty member in helping to get my research program started. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at the Department of Psychology, Tim Kelso, our chair, as well as other members of our department, Derek Montgomery, the chair that was the chair whenever I was hired, for their help in helping me to build this wild thing called a bar lab and to populate it with students. So I'm very much appreciative to them. And as well, I'd like to thank the Office of Sponsored Programs for some of their financial support in 3 different grants since I've been here at Bradley to help fund my research. We have to pay for the alcohol somehow. Most importantly, as Tim was saying, that my biggest debt of gratitude is for the students that have been involved in my research program. So you can see my current members here. I have some in the audience, as well as former members. I have a total of 19 students who are currently or former members of the students of the Stress, Emotion, and Alcohol Laboratory. And each of these students has been involved in the lab for an average of 3 semesters, ranging anywhere from 2 semesters all the way up to 6 semesters. So I spend a lot of time with each of these students as we investigate some of these programs. And like Dr. Kelso was saying, it is one of the more fulfilling parts of my job to see this transformation over their time here. In addition, I would also like to thank some of my collaborators who I'll talk about throughout our program here today. My graduate advisor, Dr. Lindsay Ham. So there is a publication of Bacon and Ham 2011 that exists in real life. That is not a joke. Also, my preceptor, Dr. Suzanne Thomas of the Medical University of South Carolina, and one of my current collaborators, Dr. Heidi Marie Blumenthal at the University of North Texas. As you'll see when we talk about some of the different methodologies, these get to be somewhat complex, and having a team of student researchers as well as professional researchers behind you really makes all the difference. So to get a little sense of my background and about why having a bar lab is an important research investment, I want to step back, and like Dr. Kelso said, I am a clinical psychologist by training. And so clinical psychology, in comparison to other types of psychology, is focused on the development, the maintenance, and the treatment of abnormal behaviors. I don't know why this is doing that. There we go. Abnormal behaviors, which we might roughly consider to be normal behaviors that are either in excess, in deficit, or behaviors that are applied at inappropriate times. And for the concept of college student drinking, we're really going to be focused more on that number 1, the excess part. So to present some national data, this is data from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, so some national level data, and their most recent data from 2015. The first point I'd like to make is that college student alcohol use is normative. So we can see here from the orange bar, representing our college students, that 58% of college students have endorsed drinking alcohol in the last 30 days. If we back that up to a year, that number reaches 80%. So the majority of college students are drinking, and this combines both underage and of-age students. Interestingly, I've got another comparison bar looking at students that are the same age but are not full-time college students. And we can see that college students are outpacing their peers in terms of alcohol use. Curiously, that's actually a reversal from what's happening prior to when they get into college. Prior to college, those who are college-bound are drinking much less than those who are not college-bound. So there's something about the college situation that increases drinking habits. And as part of my lab and I taught a course on college student alcohol use as one of our Psych 499 classes, we've pontificated on some of those social and developmental reasons. But in sum, college students are drinking. And I'll argue that that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is going to be risk-taking, reward-seeking, impulsivity are all part of the developmental stage of individuals of this age. And further, there are some positive consequences from alcohol. Relaxation, enjoyment, social cohesion, some of the reasons why we might drink as adults. Where it gets problematic, however, is the pattern of drinking that college students most typically engage in. We're not seeing college students have a glass of wine with dinner and call it a night. Rather, we see college students engaging in what we call binge drinking. Binge drinking is defined as 4 drinks for a woman or 5 drinks for a man in the course of 2 hours. And the reason for these numbers is that those numbers reach an estimated BAC of about 0.08, so a legal level of intoxication with impairments in cognition, decision-making, and motor skills. So when I ask college students who are drinkers how much they're typically drinking, we see rates that are at about the binge level. A typical day of drinking is roughly 4 drinks on average. And that number can vary anywhere from 2 all the way up to 6 or more. So students are drinking at heavy levels whenever they do drink. So we see in the last 30 days, about 38% of college students have engaged in this binge drinking pattern at least once, compared to about 33% of their non-college aged peers. And while I'll say some students might say 4 to 5 drinks in 2 hours, some adults might say 4 to 5 drinks in 2 hours, not too much of a big deal, but remember that this is only a low threshold. When we actually look at the number of drinks, it can get much higher. And finally, a concerning pattern of drinking that we might see are those who are engaging in what's called heavy drinking. So we have a smaller percentage, but still roughly 12% of our college students that are engaging in heavy drinking, defined as binge drinking 5 or more times in a month. So these are individuals that are engaging in this heavy pattern of drinking at least once a weekend, if not twice. And we see some deleterious consequences in the short term during the college years, which is why our college campuses are involved in developing some of these intervention and prevention schemes. So this is some different national level data. This one from spring 2016. This is actually a survey that Bradley students will participate in, but this is national data, asking over the last 12 months, what are a series of different consequences that you might have experienced from drinking? And we see about 25% of individuals would say they've done something that they later regret. About 21%, so 1 in 5 individuals, is going to have a blackout, or where they forget where they were or what they did during a time when they were drinking. About 15% of you jumped down, engaged in unprotected sex. About 2% were seriously committing suicide. What's not listed on here are some additional consequences that weren't assessed in this particular national survey. So individuals who are drinking are engaging in much higher academic consequences. So individuals are, about 25% will engage in some missing class, doing poorly on a test or an assignment, or needing to drop out of school due to their problematic drinking experience. So that's about 25%. And while these may be more, while certainly big, not devastating consequences, we do include devastating consequences as well, where we see about 1,800 students a year dying as a result of alcohol-related incidents. What I happen to be interested in is more of the long-term consequences. So what's happening after students are leaving college? Are they developing patterns of drinking that are maybe persisting beyond the college years? And so what I've got here is some evidence of some longitudinal data. So following people from the age of 18, that first wave, to during the college years, these two waves here, and into after college, about this wave here, ages 23 to 24. Along the vertical axis, we see rates of binge drinking, so the number of binge drinking episodes in the last 2 weeks. So for that, higher numbers are going to represent more dire consequences. And what we see is that students aren't drinking uniformly. Students are going to have different drinking patterns. So along the bottom, you're going to see 5 different drinking patterns that students might engage in. There's a missing one, 6, those who never drink, which would otherwise just be a straight line across the 0, which I don't represent. It's going to be about 38% of our students. Our first line here is going to represent those students that are going to enter college drinking already at a problematic level and are going to continue drinking at a problematic level throughout college and beyond. So this is a smaller subset of our college students, about 6%, but still individuals that are going to be coming in and having academic and social problems as a result of their drinking. We have another group of students that are drinking also problematically whenever they enter college, but who are going to decline in their use throughout as they get older. So maybe developing some responsibilities, getting a job, maybe becoming more mature and stopping engaging in that binge drinking behavior. Another more problematic consequence, one that we want to focus on, are those individuals who are not drinking problematically when they start at college, but engage in an increasing rate of drinking throughout their college experience and go on to drink at even higher levels once they graduate. So this is our increased population that represents about 10% of our college sample. Our next group is our fling group. This is what we might consider the prototypical college student. So those who aren't drinking whenever they get here, that are drinking during college, where'd my arrow go there? And then whenever they graduate are quote unquote maturing out. So go on to drink at non-problematic levels once they graduate. This is about 13% of our students. And then finally, we have a bottom group of individuals that are going to engage in some binge drinking, but never going to be a significant or a very big amount. So whenever we're thinking of intervention strategies, we note that there's actually not too much that differentiates these bottom 3 groups that are not problematic whenever they enter college. So there's not much that can forewarn us about who is going to end up drinking problematically when they graduate, who is going to be our folks that are drinking problematically during school but will mature out, and those who will never go on to develop problems. So that's one of the challenges for those of us who are working especially with freshmen, is to target and develop interventions that are going to meet these possible escalating risks. So what I'd like to focus my discussion on are some of the different methods that we use to try to understand this behavior of college student drinking, because it is something that our researchers generally don't have direct access to. And it's something that, because they're being intoxicated, students might not be the best reporters of after the fact. So the field of looking at these different behaviors has developed various different methods of trying to ascertain what college drinking behaviors are like to help us put together a better image. And what I'm going to talk about are different methods that are going to vary in terms of their external versus internal validity. So those of our psychology students in the audience should be very familiar with these terms. But if you're not familiar with these terms, external validity is talking about studies that are going to be more representative or more generalizable of the typical drinking experience. Whereas our internal validity methods are going to be ones that are done in laboratories, so they're not going to be quite as realistic, but the benefit of these is that we can actually identify causal mechanisms. So what sorts of behaviors, environments, internal factors might cause somebody to drink more heavily? And these are things that we can only really well get in these laboratory studies. So I'm going to talk about a few, some that are directly related to the actual drinking experience, like self-reports, field studies, and something called ecological momentary assessment. And then I'll talk a little bit about my specialty, which are controlled laboratory studies, so what we're doing in the bar lab. I should also note that animal models and basic research also help to comprise this picture, but those are a little further out of my wheelhouse. You might talk to Dr. Kelso about that, but I'm going to be sticking with the human subjects research. So first is our most obvious method of assessing what people are doing, asking them. So the data that I've collected are represented so far, how much people are using, binge drinking, these patterns of drinking over time. These are all based on people's self-report of what they're drinking and when. So you're answering questions about your drinking behavior and some related constructs about why you might be drinking, what consequences you might have. We can ask these questions cross-sectionally, which means we're getting one snapshot picture. Or we can ask these questions longitudinally, like the latest data that I presented, where we're following people over time to get a picture of how these behaviors might change. Now, some benefits of this and why this is a very widely used tool is because it's really easy. I can send out questionnaires, I can ask people, and for the most part, their answers are pretty accurate. They're not too far off of what exactly is happening. The person that is only drinking 2 drinks a night can easily identify that and can differentiate that from the person that's drinking 10 drinks a night. So we can get some rough differentiation here. Easy to collect data, easy to collect large amounts of data. Some of the drawbacks is that some of the things that we might be interested in are things that students are either not paying attention to or that they just don't have available for recall. So they may not have an accurate insight as to why they might be drinking or what some of the environmental influences are whenever they are drinking. So they just might not be aware of that. So what can help us to get a better picture of that are actually going to the field and going to the places where students are drinking. So these field studies involve either observation and or data collection in the places where students are engaging in these drinking behaviors, such as bars or house parties. Now, I actually haven't done any of this research myself yet. We spent a lot of time as a lab at the end of last fall semester trying to come up with some ideas about how we might do this. As you'll see, it gets to be a little resource intensive, so we've scaled back a little bit. But I love these designs. I think they're incredibly creative. So what I'm going to present are some data from some information from a faculty member named John Clapp, who's working at San Diego State University, so a much bigger institution than we have. So the paper that Dr. Clapp and his colleagues did in 2007 was simply talking about some of the involved methodology that they used to get into these areas and to systematically evaluate them. So for this example, what I've got up here is talking about going to bars. And they talk a lot about some of the barriers in actually getting access to bars. So permission from the bar owners to set up a station outside of their bar to collect information from those patrons that are coming in and coming out, and information about what might be happening in the bar. As you might imagine, a bar owner might be very trepidatious about somebody observing that information. But it is, of course, very important to people's drinking patterns. So he talks a little bit about how they would overcome these barriers in this particular area of San Diego. And I'll talk a little bit about what they did in terms of observation. They would send in 2 trained research assistants who would enter this bar and pretend to be patrons. And you can see part of their task illustrated up here is actually mapping out the space. So some of our environmental researchers here might be very interested in how tight proximity versus a wider space might influence drinking patterns. The number of bars you have set up, I think there's a temporary bar stationed over here. So the number of access points to alcohol, whether you have a waitress coming by or you need to go up to the bar, all of these things might influence how much somebody might drink in that context. And further, you can see a list of some of the things that these observers were looking for. And you can identify some that our bar goers simply might not be aware of or paying attention to, which is why this is going to build on that self-report information. So some things like whether or not the bartender is free pouring, so not using a shot glass to measure what they're pouring, or whether they appear to be over pouring. They might be aware of whether or not there's a cover, and you can imagine that might influence who's at the bar and how much they're drinking. Whether there's food available, which is going to maybe slow down that intoxication process. As well as down towards the bottom here, you can see whether or not these pseudo patrons, they went up to try to order 2 Long Island iced teas. And if you're familiar with Long Island iced teas, you know that they contain quite a bit of alcohol. And 2 is going to put somebody well over the legal limit. So what they were looking for is whether or not a bartender or a waitress would serve 2 drinks to an individual that would put them well over this limit, or they would try to dissuade them. So again, getting better sense of the environment in which somebody is drinking. Now, perhaps a little more relevant to Bradley's campus, many of our students are actually drinking at house parties rather than at bars, especially our students that are under the age of 21. So Clapp and his research team also ventured out into some of these house parties. They developed a map of the residential neighborhood where a lot of the students were living outside of San Diego State's campus. They would drive by, they would notice whether or not a party was taking place, so it had to be observable from outside. They would knock on the door, they would find the host and ask the host if they would be able to come in and collect some data. So we might imagine that there was some incentive involved. They did get some money or some gift certificates to help pave that along, as well as some assurances that none of the data were going to be tied to them or linked to them or police not called. So you can imagine some of the assurances that would need to be provided in order to collect this information. So we can see in this situation, Clapp and his research team went to 66 different parties in the San Diego area and interviewed over 1,300 people. Most of them, as you can see, were under the age of 21, so 32% age 21 and over, so a lot of these were underage participants. About a little less than half were female, and most of them were college students. So these were outside the college campus, so we can't confirm whether or not it was students versus not students. But in this case, mostly students. And so after approaching the party host and getting permission to enter the party, there was a team of anywhere from 6 to 7 different researchers. 2 of them were assigned to make observations, and part of that observation was drawing a map like you see here, targeting where the beer cans were, where the kegs were, where the alcohol bottles were, if there were any illicit drugs, where they were, and kind of mapping out the area. Our other 4 to 5 researchers were actually interviewing the party goers, interviewing them about why they were drinking, about if they were drinking before they came to the party, as well as collecting a breathalyzer, BRAC, breath alcohol content. What they found was that the average breath alcohol content, or the average BAC, was about the legal limit, 0.08. Although this varied quite a bit. We have a variance of about 0.06, so some individuals were much higher than that 0.08 limit, and some were much below. And about 10% of the variance was attributable to what party you were at. So depending on the party you were at, you were likely to drink more, or you were likely to drink less, depending on what kinds of things were going on around you. And again, we're adding to some of the information that we couldn't have really gotten very well from these self-report measures. So some of the things that the study found was that individuals who came to the party in order to socialize were drinking less or reaching lower BACs than those who came for other reasons, like for hooking up or starting a fight, were some of the other reasons that it could be. So those individuals might be drinking more. Individuals, unsurprisingly, who were playing drinking games were getting more intoxicated than those who weren't. And again, unsurprisingly, those with a past history of heavy drinking were reaching higher BACs at this party than those without a higher history of heavy drinking. But in addition to some of these individual level characteristics, we could also get some broader characteristics about things that were happening at the party. So surprisingly, large parties resulted in lower BACs than small parties. And this is counterintuitive to some of the other research that was based on self-report, but the researchers hypothesized that it's a simple access issue. If you have money for one keg and 50 people, that's not going to go as far as if you have one keg for 20 people. As well, the kind of alcohol that you might have, if there's a bar or a keg set up, you might have to wait in line longer to get access to alcohol if the party is larger. They also found that observers were also rating the number of intoxicated partygoers who looked to be drunk. And unsurprisingly, if there's more people around that look to be drunk, we're going to get higher BACs from the people there at the party. And a curious thing that they found, and one of the reasons why these field studies can produce such rich data, is something that they didn't set out to find. They noted that some of the parties had themes. Students, what are some theme parties? Beach, what? 90s parties? Toga parties, excellent. Pajama parties? Are there some with some sexualized themes? A little bit? What else? Pretty nasty, all right. What else? You guys, this is some rich data collection happening. Halloween, okay. Some things that they found that were surprising were that if it was a theme party, it didn't really matter to the men. Men are gonna drink the same regardless of if it's a theme party or if it's not a theme party. But for the women, women are getting much more intoxicated if it's a theme party than if it's not a theme party. So this was something they actually didn't set out to find, and they kind of went forward with this with a different line of research and investigated whether or not the theme was a sexualized theme or not. Found that the females are actually participating more actively in the theme. They're more likely to dress up than the guys. They're more likely to be supported for engaging in more sexual behavior. So all of these things might attribute to women drinking higher or more amounts in these theme parties. So kind of a curious finding that they wouldn't have found otherwise. So I mentioned some of the benefits here that we're actually in these scenarios. We're not relying on retrospective recall of what you've done over the past 12 months. We're asking you what's happening right now. We're able to get some rich environmental data of information that participants might not have access to. And we can uncover cool new things that we might not have even thought about, like this issue with theme parties. Some drawbacks, however, you might imagine. Some people wouldn't let them into parties. The party hosts or the bars might be concerned about what the implications of this might be. So we might not have equal access to all the various types of parties. They were just parties that were noticeable from the street. So some of the more subdued parties where there still might be drinking might not have been represented here. But there's also some ethical concerns. What happens if a researcher goes in and observes illegal activity? Observes drugs being used? Observe somebody who is grossly and maybe unsafely intoxicated and have the breathalyzer to prove it. Do they have any ethical obligations at that point? It becomes a thornier issue. So another study that actually goes in the moment is something called an ecological momentary assessment. This is in-time monitoring of drinking behaviors and related constructs, where we're actually collecting data from individuals based on, used to be a Palm Pilot, but now it's getting up to cell phones and participants' own cell phones. So it uses technology to ask people questions while they're in these scenarios. So again, getting some very rich data. I think the authors of one of the study called this a high resolution way to assess alcohol-related behaviors. And these completion of these surveys in real time might be time contingent. That means they might get asked these questions in the evening or during the weekends where people are more likely to be drinking. Or they might be event contingent. You might be asked to respond to these surveys whenever you start drinking or whenever you're at a party to answer questions about what's going on. So you can see here I've got an image of what this might look on a cell phone. So we've got somebody asking, where are you right now, and have different options. So we can see various places where drinking might be occurring. In this particular study where I've got mapped out, they were asking questions about mood. They were asking questions about what were your motives for drinking? Were you drinking in order to cope with a bad mood? Or were you drinking to enhance a good mood? They were asking questions about how many drinks you were consuming. As well as the following day, they were able to ask about some alcohol use disorder symptoms like hangovers. So we're able to get all of these things in real time and collect a very rich tapestry of data. So some of the benefits, again, we're getting a lot of great data in the situations where people are drinking while they're happening. We're not relying on these retrospective reports. But one of the drawbacks is, first of all, people don't always complete the surveys when they're supposed to. So there's large amounts of missing data, as well as there's a whole lot of data. So there's a lot of very sophisticated statistical techniques necessary in order to evaluate and make sense of this. So these are some of our studies that are actually going to the places where people are drinking and asking people about or observing what's actually happening. The downside to all of these methodologies is that we still can't make any causal conclusions. We can draw ideas about things that might be associated with higher or lower levels of drinking, but we don't have the kind of sophisticated or controlled laboratory study that allows us to say that this causes higher drinking, which is what we really need whenever we're developing tools for prevention and intervention. So that's where my research in using controlled laboratory studies comes in. So it's going to be less realistic. I try to set up a bar, but it is still a place on campus where you wouldn't typically drink. But the benefit is that I'm able to strategically manipulate just one variable to see if it's that thing that causes a difference in drinking. So in laboratory methods, we're conducting experiments using random assignment to assign individuals to one condition or another, keeping everything else the same except for that variable that we think might cause increased drinking. And we can use this tool to examine some of those causal related questions. So this is a picture of my bar lab. These are some of our graduates, Maxie, Brooke, and Tiffany, testing out and displaying our bar lab setup. As you can see, we've got dimmer lights, we've got pub tables, we've got dartboards, we've got lighted signs, we've got music playing, which you obviously can't see, posters, lights, the whole shebang. We try to make it very realistic. And in doing this, we can either choose to have participants drink alcohol, or we can try to measure alcohol use behavior in other ways. If we do have our participants drink alcohol, as you might imagine, we have a number of different ethical obligations and safety obligations that may be very different from the kinds of situations where people are normally drinking. So we'll ask students questions. First of all, they all have to be if they're drinking over the age of 21, which we know is not the only people that are drinking here on college campuses. We're asking them about their health history, medications they might be taking. We have females engage in a urine pregnancy test to make sure they're not pregnant. We make sure that individuals have had experience with alcohol. We don't want their bar lab experience to be their first alcohol drinking experience. But neither do we want individuals that are already problematic drinkers. So we want to make sure to get them access to other resources. So drinking in my bar lab is much safer than the kinds of environments where students might otherwise be drinking. So my research program while I've been here is looking at the effects of stress on people's alcohol consumption. And this might seem like a foregone conclusion. Of course, when you're stressed, you're going to have some alcohol. That is our culture, or part of our culture for many individuals, is that having a bad day at the office, you're going to come home and pour yourself a drink. I'm probably going to have a drink when I get done with this. So how might stress influence people's decisions to drink, particularly college students? And the reason why this is so important is that those who choose to drink in order to cope with stress, who might not have other more productive methods of coping with stress, tend to be our people that are going to be more likely to develop alcohol use problems. So I'm not saying that drinking to cope with stress is a bad thing, but if that's the only tool in your toolbox for coping with stress, it does lead to some more dangerous outcomes. So we want to try to identify what are some of the situational contexts that might produce that pattern of behavior. So many of the studies and some of the research that I did with Suzanne Thomas at the Medical University of South Carolina were looking at some of these stress and alcohol relationships. And what they found were that it's the social kinds of stressors that tended to be better predictors of whether or not people would drink in a laboratory environment. But the truth is that a lot of the social stressors that were used were very uncommon to people's typical drinking experience. So having to give a speech was a very common stressor. But college students don't often give speeches whenever they're drinking. So that doesn't seem like the most realistic way to depict stress in a college student drinking environment. So my research has been focused on a different kind of stressor, social ostracism, or being left out of a peer group. For all of us, this is a concern, but for individuals in their young adulthood, this might be a very important developmental threat. This is an age where people are trying to define themselves and define their relationships to others. And being excluded from a group might be particularly traumatic, or not traumatic, but at least very stressful. And so my research is actually, this is the second study that was ever published looking at the effects of ostracism on drinking. I was scooped by 4 months. A little bitter. But what we're looking at is, does social ostracism impact or lead to increased drinking? And so this was a study that I did in conjunction with a former student here, Alexi Cranford, who is currently a graduate student at the University of Nebraska, as well as my collaborator at the University of North Texas, Heidi Marie Blumenthal, and something that was published in 2015. So we brought participants into the lab. We brought 40 participants in. This was a study where they were going to be drinking, so we had participants over the age of 21 with an average age of 22. They were about half female and primarily Caucasian. When students came into the bar lab, they were randomly assigned to one of 2 different conditions: to be excluded from a group or to be included into a group. And we did that by having them play this online computer game called Cyberball. It's a little weird. So our participant was told that they were playing this game with 2 other participants in the study who were in different rooms, and that they were assigned to be participant 2 or player 2 down here at the bottom. And the game consisted of 40 different ball tosses between players 1, 2, and 3. So when the participant got the ball as player 2, they could click on either player 3 or player 1 to throw the ball to either of them. In the inclusion condition, the participant got the ball an equal amount. They got 33% of the ball tosses. We were all tossing the ball and having a good time. If you were excluded, however, you got the ball tossed to you once at the beginning, but then you had to watch the remaining 39 ball tosses between players 1 and 3. So again, this is not something that happens while you're drinking, yes, but it does actually very strongly evoke diminished mood, diminished self-esteem, diminished feelings of belonging and control over your environment, temporarily. So it has incredibly strong psychological effects and gives us a good chance to test, do those strong psychological effects lead to changes in alcohol use? So we told participants they were going to be involved in a second study where we were looking at how their personality maps on to how they might taste different alcohols. So we gave them this mock taste test. They were presented with 2 mugs of beer, labeled A and B, given a list of different descriptors and asked to rate these beers on hoppiness, oakiness, bitterness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We weren't as interested in that. We were interested in how much beer they consumed. There were 2 12-ounce mugs, so 710 milliliters total. How much beer would they consume depending on what condition they had just experienced? And here are our results. So to walk you through this here, we've got the beer consumed during the taste test on the vertical axis. Along the bottom, we have our inclusion and exclusion conditions. And in the orange, we have males, and in the gray, we have females. So what you can see if you look at the 2 orange bars, males were unaffected in terms of their alcohol use. Regardless of if they were included or excluded, they're drinking, and they're drinking more than the females. Not surprising, men tend to drink more than women. But where this really seemed to have an effect were for the females. Females that were included were drinking at a rate similar to the males that were included, but females that were excluded were drinking far less than either their excluded male counterparts or their included female counterparts. So rather than ostracism causing increased drinking, we found in this scenario that ostracism for females resulted in decreased drinking. And we imagine that that might be, and we're still investigating some subsequent results, a safety cue issue. Females are more likely to engage in safety behaviors whenever they are drinking, which might include going out to drink with friends that you know, not drinking around strangers. And so females who were presented with these ambiguous participants in other rooms who just left them out might sense some threat and thus decrease their drinking behavior. So we're trying to follow up and try to figure out why that might be if that hypothesis was correct. One of the downsides to this research, I've done this study as well as an in-person ostracism task, were that whenever we have these alcohol drinking or alcohol consumption tasks, we have to use smaller numbers of participants. It just takes a really long time to get this happening, about 5 hours, 4 to 5 hours. So my latest study that we actually just wrapped up this semester didn't involve alcohol consumption at all, which allowed us to get many more participants. We had over 200, and it allowed us to get participants that were under the age of 21. So you can see we have about 90% of our sample were under the age of 21. The majority of them were freshmen. And still the majority of them had had alcohol in the past year at about 88%. For this study, to induce ostracism, we presented them with this hypothetical house party. You're going to a party on a Friday night. We presented this hypothetical house party with a series of PowerPoint slides, which had visuals, which had some audio, kind of describing the scenario to them. And at this hypothetical house party, they either came to the party by themselves, alone, they came to the party with one other person, or they came to the party with a small group of people. And if they arrived with people, those people abandoned them at the party. And while they were at the party, they were forced to approach a group of strangers. And this group of strangers either included them into their circle. So welcome, nice to meet you, introducing you to other people at the party. Or they excluded you, shunned you, and walked away. And we measured the effects of that ostracism on alcohol use. We brought them to the bar. We had these different bottles set up. And the bottles actually didn't contain alcohol at all, but rather contained water dyed to look like the alcohol. We asked participants if they would drink in the scenario that they just viewed, and most of them said they would, about 76%. And we collected what they selected, how much they poured, their gender, and their weight to estimate their BAC. So what their BAC would be drinking at that rate in an hour. And we see that our average BAC was about a 0.05, but again, that also varied widely, with some people drinking much less and some people drinking much more. So here's the data that we just collected. What I find most interesting to note are the two groups of bars to the far left and the far right. Those who arrive to the party alone versus those who arrive to the party with more than one person. And you can see that these bars flip. When you go to the party alone, you're going to drink more when you're included. So when people welcome you, more likely to be drinking at higher levels. That's going to reverse whenever you arrive to the party with more than one person, a group of people, even though they're not around right then when you're being included or ostracized. We find that if you have people at the party who you arrived with and you've been excluded, this is the group that's going to drink more. And that last difference there is significant. So we can see some additional context that we need to add to this situation. It may not be just ostracism, but other cues in the environment that might influence drinking behavior. And we're continuing to mine that data, again, we just finished collecting it, about some of the reasons why people might have chosen to drink in that particular scenario. So we want to wrap up a little bit by talking about some of the implications here for treatment. Like I mentioned, that the individuals that are drinking while they're engaging in this college experience have a series of consequences that can not only affect their academic performance and their safety, but can also affect the academic performance and the safety of individuals around them. So it is a concern for administrators and faculty alike. What I've got up here, and I know it's too small to read, but what this is actually a matrix of effective, or demonstrated to be effective prevention and intervention tools published by the National Institutes of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. And this was published last year. And what they've done is went to the literature, found what treatments were demonstrated to be effective, and mapped all of the various treatments out on the left axis, kind of going up and down. We have treatments that are going to start off with demonstrated effectiveness, moderate effectiveness, low effectiveness, as well as those interventions that actually were not effective at all, or that we don't have enough data to assess their effectiveness. Along the top there, we have the cost of implementation, so that campuses can attack the low cost or low hanging fruit first, and then decide which of the more high cost options to take advantage of. Now, while this is fairly small, I wanted to call out some of the more highly effective techniques. They broke this out by individual-based interventions. These are typically going to be administered to individuals that have demonstrated alcohol use problems and that we want to intervene before they get too severe. And we can see some of the things, what I've got in asterisks here, are programs that Bradley has implemented. So you can see that eChug and Alcohol EDU are some of the intervention tools that are used whenever individuals have an alcohol use sanction. These kinds of tools are going to be things that are going to give some personalized feedback about their own drinking behaviors and how their drinking behaviors compare to their college peers. What we find is that individuals that are drinking very heavily tend to think that the people around them are also drinking heavily. And they can often benefit by that big dichotomy, seeing that you are drinking well above the people around you. And sometimes that stark difference is enough to change behavior. And we've got some demonstrated efficacy rates to show that. We've got some things at the environmental level as well. And these are all the things that were rated as highly effective. But you'll notice that these aren't things that colleges can do in isolation. These are things that colleges, if they want to implement or have happen, need to work with their local communities and their state communities to make sure that these programs are secured. So these are things that are demonstrated to reduce college student drinking, like restricting happy hours and price promotions, retaining the age 21. There's a lot of debate about whether or not we should lower the drinking age. That actually pans out to causing more problems than it prevents. And increasing alcohol tax, so limiting the access to alcohol altogether. And finally, I want to end with this cartoon. So every time I give this talk or a similar talk, I have people come up to me and talk about their college lives and their college experiences and how instrumental alcohol was to that experience. And how this may just be a cultural thing and that's something that cannot change. And so what this is illustrating is we see a guy who's smoking being dragged out of a restaurant. And in my own lifetime, I've seen the societal norms or societal pressures on smoking changed. When I was young, you could smoke in restaurants. You can't smoke in restaurants now. We've banned smoking from campus. And so certainly if norms regarding smoking can change, perhaps our norms about alcohol use on campuses can change as well. We may not want to limit drinking entirely. It does have some positive consequences. But can we do things to reduce the scope or the magnitude of drinking and limit some of these dangerous effects? And that's all I got. Thanks, everybody. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take them. If anybody would like snacks, they're over there. Yes?
Just wondered whether observer effects are a concern in your study design. I had an inclination to imagine that you might drink less if you might be observed.
That's an excellent point. So does the fact that you're being watched affect how much you're drinking? And the answer is yes, but we try to get around that. So in the study that I presented where people were engaging in that taste test task, there was nobody in the room while that was happening. And we tried to disguise the motive of what we were looking for. Tried to demonstrate that we were looking for taste profiles and weren't really looking at the amount that they were drinking. So we tried to hide what exactly we were measuring. It also becomes a problem whenever you want to have more than one person in a room drinking at the same time. We know that people tend to match the rates of drinking of the people around them. And so the studies that I've presented have just had one person in the room, which prevents that, but also limits the external validity, because that's not really how you drink. And so there's always this kind of push and pull balance about how you might accommodate that. But that's an excellent question and something we always need to be paying attention to. It's why my students do all the data collection and I'm never there. Yeah?
Yeah, I see that your research so far has been on drinking motivated by negative effects.
Mm-hmm.
But last week with the Cubs winning the World Series, there was a whole lot of drinking motivated to sustain or celebrate positive effects. Like, do you see that coming up in your lab? And can you just give me some thoughts about literature that exists about the two different motivations?
Absolutely.
Positive effect or...
Absolutely. So while my focus is on negative coping motive, coping with negative emotion, that's not the most common reason why students are drinking. It's the one that actually leads to the worst outcomes, but it's not the most common reason. Rather, the most common reason are for social motives, because it promotes social cohesion, it's what everybody's doing, it helps me to bond with the people around me, or enhancement motives, I like how it feels. So related to the Cubs victory, there's a big literature or an emerging literature talking about urgency, a kind of impulsivity. So drinking as a result of positive urgency, like the Cubs just won. I have a test tomorrow, like happened in our Psych 101 class, but impulsively, because of my good mood, I'm going to stay out drinking. And so we see that positive mood can play a role in typically reaching higher BACs, but those individuals are generally not the ones that are going to go on to have the longer term problems. So you're exactly right that positive mood can also influence drinking behaviors.
That'll only happen once every 180 years.
Right, so we don't have to worry about that for another 100 years. But an excellent question. So mood does involve or does surround drinking, both positive and negative mood. Others, yes sir.
You know, it's believed that if kids are around alcohol when they're young and it's no big deal, they won't go crazy when they get to college. Is there any evidence to support that?
There's a lot of evidence. All of it contradicts that. So permissive drinking by parents, in a glass of wine at the dinner table as a teenager, tends to result in higher drinking whenever individuals enter college compared to parents that are less permissive and are very clear that drinking is not something that's acceptable when you're underage. So it's counterintuitive. Students really hate it when I talk to them about it. They think it's a good idea. People tend to think it's a good idea, but there's a mountain of evidence that contradicts it. Presenting a very clear and hard line that drinking underage is not acceptable, but modeling appropriate drinking behavior in yourself. So not getting wasted in front of your kids. Did you have a question?
Yeah, what age do you want to research alcohol and its effects?
Excellent question. Accident. I can't say that I had any burning desire or passion or motive to save the world when I started this. I started actually this research train as an undergraduate. When I was at the University of Texas, I was in a class. I hated research methods. I did not want to be a researcher. But I was in a class where they were advertising or recruiting for research assistants to participate in this bar lab. And my thought was, that sounds like an easy A. And it was, but it was also awesome. It was exactly what my classes weren't, which was taking one big problem that I could see in the world around me and systematically evaluating it and postulating these questions and trying to find the literature that might support or differentiate that, and using research to ask these new questions. So investigating alcohol initially was an accident. I tried to stray away and look at anxiety while I was in graduate school, but my advisor got ill. We hired somebody new that studied both alcohol and anxiety. So serendipity, I kept getting drawn into this alcohol field, which I find incredibly fascinating, incredibly applied to the everyday professional life that I'm in, being surrounded by college students. But it wasn't something that I necessarily set out with that mission or that motive. So be open to experience. Yes?
In the class study, you had talked about how they went into house parties and they were looking at how much people were drinking. They talked about kegs and beer. Did they have anything with like mixed drinks or like jungle juice where it's harder to determine what alcohol content is in each glass?
Absolutely. So we know whenever people are drinking, they're not necessarily drinking out of pre-poured bottles of beer. They might be drinking things like jungle juice or pouring vodka willy-nilly into a glass. And they did monitor that. They kind of kept track of it. But obviously they can't determine the alcohol content of this bottle of, or this keg of, this bucket, I don't know, trash can? What are they putting jungle juice in? This bowl? This bowl of jungle juice versus the next party's bowl of jungle juice. There might be very different alcohol content. But what they did do is get breathalyzers. So at the end of the day, that tended to be their main outcome. But you're right that there might not be very well established ways of assessing what was being drank. Yes?
Do students at Bradley have an academic understanding of the risks of heavy drinking? And is increasing the number of courses that teach the kinds of things that you're studying, would that help them to deal with drinking in an academic way? Or is this something that's based on motivations that are beyond our intellectual work? I mean, they're just impulses that drive people towards the heavy drinking.
Excellent. So I think if you were to ask the students, they would all say yes. We know the dangers of drinking. We know how alcohol is metabolized in the body. We can maybe present them some cool things that they don't really know, but they know academically, which is why you'll see in matrices like this, if you could see it, I know it's really small, that academic or education alone is usually ineffective at changing drinking behaviors. Rather, the things that are more effective are things like providing personalized feedback about an individual's own personal experience and how that might compare to the experience of others. And presenting your own personal values and how your drinking behavior might interfere with your own personal values. It's important for me to be strong academically, but I'm seeing that my drinking is preventing me from doing as well. So trying to enhance these personalized experiences seems to be more effective than just blanket education about some of the effects of alcohol or the consequences of drinking. So getting students kind of where they are and where they live tends to be more effective. So increasing alcohol programming, not necessarily most effective. Yes?
I have a question regarding the age.
Mhm.
When I was growing up, it was actually much lower, it was 19. And one of the things that I observed, obviously not a scientific study, because at that time I wasn't thinking along those lines, but within my circle of friends and even a larger group, that when people became of legal drinking age, their drinking tended to go from less binge, trying to consume everything to make sure you didn't get caught with it, versus becoming more social.
And that tends to bear out. We see that our of-age students are drinking more than our underage students because they have easier access to alcohol, but they are experiencing higher ultimate VACs and more consequences from their drinking. So our students who are of age aren't getting into the kinds of dangerous situations where they might need to binge drink or drink a whole lot because you only got one shot at this, you might as well try to take full advantage of it. So while our older students are still drinking and drinking more, our freshmen and our underage students tend to be drinking more problematically and risky and having more consequences as a result. So your observations bear out.
So what I was getting at is one of your items that were saying that would reduce drinking on campus was to retain the 21 drinking age.
Mm-hmm.
And that result seems to kind of contradict that.
It does and it doesn't. So the pro-21 drinking age is actually based on historical data because we had a natural experiment because states didn't change their drinking age from 18 to 21 all at once. States were changing depending on their particular state legislatures. So we could actually model consequences, most commonly traffic accidents, as a result of shifting the age from 18 to 21. And the evidence suggests that making access to alcohol more difficult resulted in less drinking overall and less traffic fatalities. So again, our of-age students are still drinking, and they're still drinking a lot, and they're drinking more often than our underage students. But it's our underage students that are involved in the risky patterns that might lead to consequences. Yeah?
How long have you been on continuing your research?
I'm up for tenure right now, so as long as you'll have me. It's a loaded question.
Well, on that positive note, I want to thank Dr. Bacon very much for her well-researched, her well-organized, and her well-presented presentation. Thank you very much. So Amy is a little token of gratitude from the college.
Lovely, thank you.